In the early 1770s, the wealthiest group of people in British North America did not live in Boston or Philadelphia or along the tobacco rivers of Virginia. They lived in and around a small port city at the southern tip of a narrow peninsula in South Carolina, where the Ashley and Cooper rivers empty into the Atlantic. The city was called Charlestown, and per capita, its inhabitants possessed more wealth than those of any other colonial settlement on the continent. Archaeological and economic research has borne this out again and again. A century after its founding, Charleston was, by any reasonable measure, the richest city in what would become the United States of America. And the source of all that wealth was a single grain: rice. That fact alone should stop you, because nothing about rice sounds like the foundation of an empire. Cotton, sure. Tobacco, maybe. Gold, obviously. But rice? The key to understanding Charleston is understanding what rice meant in the 18th century Atlantic world and what it cost to grow it. Because the economics of Carolina rice didn't just make planters wealthy. They made planters wealthy on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. And they did it through a system of labor so brutal and so total that the entire civilization of Charleston, its architecture, its music, its manners, its politics, was shaped by it. Rice arrived in the Carolina colony sometime in the 1680s or 1690s, not long after the settlement was founded in 1670 under a charter from the Lords Proprietors honoring King Charles II. The early colonists tried a number of cash crops. Silk didn't take. Wine grapes failed. But rice, a long grain variety that would come to be known as Carolina gold, flourished in the boggy tidal flats of the Low Country. The numbers tell the story of what happened next. In the years between 1698 and 1702, Carolina exported an average of roughly 268,000 pounds of rice per year. By 1740, that figure had surpassed 30 million pounds. By the early 1770s, it was 66 million pounds annually, flowing out of Charleston Harbor to ports in England, Portugal, and the Caribbean. And here is the part that made Charleston what it became. Growing rice in the Low Country was extraordinarily difficult. The tidal cultivation system that planters adopted in the mid-18th century required immense earthwork, dikes, canals, trunk gates, to flood and drain the fields with the rhythm of the tides. It was back-breaking, dangerous work performed in malarial swamps, and it demanded not just labor, but expertise. The planters knew this. Ship manifests and sale records show that slave traders operating out of Charleston deliberately sought enslaved people from the rice-growing regions of West Africa, from Senegambia, the Windward Coast, Sierra Leone, people who understood the cultivation of rice in ways that the European planters themselves did not. The knowledge that built Charleston's fortune was, to a significant degree, African knowledge, applied under conditions of forced labor in American swamps. The numbers involved were staggering. Sullivan's Island, a sandy barrier island at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, served as the quarantine station where enslaved Africans were held in so-called pest houses before being transported to the city for sale. By credible historical estimates, more than 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to British North America entered through Sullivan's Island. That single island was, for African Americans, what Ellis Island would later be for European immigrants, except that the people passing through Sullivan's Island were not arriving voluntarily, and they were not free. The wealth this system generated was immense and concentrated. A planter named Miles Brewton, who made his fortune as a slave trader and merchant, commissioned what is still considered one of the finest Georgian townhouses in the United States, a double house on King Street, completed around 1769, with a two-story portico of Doric and Ionic columns in imported Portland stone. The house cost a fortune. It was designed to announce to anyone walking past that the man inside had arrived at the very top of colonial society. Brewton was elected a delegate to the Continental Congress, but never served. In August of 1775, he and his entire family were lost at sea while sailing to Philadelphia. The house passed to his sister, Rebecca. It has remained in the same extended family ever since, more than 250 years in the same bloodline. During the Revolution, the British commandeered it as the headquarters for General Sir Henry Clinton. During the Civil War, Union officers took it as their headquarters. Both times, the family got the house back. It is still a private residence. You can walk past it on King Street today and not realize that you are looking at a building that has outlasted every economic system, every war, and every catastrophe that has struck Charleston since the reign of George III. That kind of durability was unusual, but the ambition behind the Brewton House was not. By the mid-18th century, the planters of the Low Country were building a city that rivaled anything in colonial America for cultural sophistication. In 1736, Charleston opened the first building in North America designed exclusively for theatrical performances, on Dock Street, near the corner of Church Street, at a site that would later become the Planters Hotel and eventually the Dock Street Theater that still operates today. The opening production was a comedy called The Recruiting Officer. In 1766, the St. Cecilia Society was established, making it one of the oldest musical organizations in the country. Its subscription concerts drew the plantation elite in imported silks and London fashions, and admission was so exclusive that membership would remain invitation only for the next 2.5 centuries. In 1770, the College of Charleston was founded, the oldest college in South Carolina and the 13th oldest in the United States. In 1773, the Charleston Museum was established, the first museum in America. The first golf club in the country was organized in Charleston in 1787. This was not a backwater. This was a city that thought of itself, with considerable justification, as the cultural capital of the South. And the buildings matched the ambition. In 1761, St. Michael's Episcopal Church was completed at the corner of Broad and Meeting Streets, its 186-foot steeple visible from the harbor and from miles up the Ashley River. It was the tallest structure in the city and served as a navigation landmark for arriving ships. A fire watchman was posted in the steeple around the clock, charged with hanging a red lantern if he spotted smoke anywhere on the densely built peninsula. The Exchange Building, completed in 1771 at the foot of Broad Street, served as the customs house and commercial center, the place where goods were inspected, duties paid, and deals struck. It was in the Exchange that South Carolinians would later ratify the U.S. Constitution. And throughout the city, private wealth produced private architecture on a scale unmatched in the colonies. The Hayward Washington House on Church Street, built in 1772 by Daniel Hayward, a rice planter. Drayton Hall, completed in 1742 on the Ashley River in the Palladian style, with construction so meticulous that it has stood essentially unrenovated for nearly 3 centuries. The planters spent much of the year on their plantations, but they came to Charleston for the social season, and more pragmatically, to escape the malaria that made the rice fields lethal during the warmer months. They built townhouses of a form found nowhere else in America, the Charleston Single House, a narrow building set perpendicular to the street, 1 room wide, with long covered porches, called piazzas, running along the south or west side to catch the prevailing breeze. If you walk through the street south of Broad today, you will see hundreds of them, and you will also notice something odd on many of the older buildings. Small iron discs and stars, some round, some cross-shaped, bolted flat against the brick facades. Most visitors assume they are decorative. They are not. But that part of the story comes later. The rhythm of Charleston's golden age had a strange, almost theatrical quality. The social season ran from roughly November to March. The St. Cecilia Society held its concerts. The Jockey Club held its races, one of the first organized horse racing clubs in the country. The planters filled their townhouses with imported furniture, silver, and porcelain. They sent their sons to England for education. And then, in the spring, they returned to the plantations and the rice fields, where the actual work of sustaining all of this was performed by people who had no share in any of it. The Revolution interrupted this world, but did not destroy it. The British first tried to take Charleston in 1776 and failed. Their fleet was repulsed at Fort Sullivan on Sullivan's Island, where Colonel William Moultrie's men, sheltered behind walls of palmetto logs, absorbed the bombardment. The spongy palmetto wood didn't shatter. It absorbed the cannonballs. South Carolina put the palmetto on its state flag and never took it off. But the British came back. In May of 1780, after a 6-week siege, Charleston surrendered, the largest American surrender of the war, with more than 5,000 Continental soldiers captured. The Miles Brewton House became Clinton's headquarters. British officers scratched their profiles into marble mantels. The occupation lasted over 2 years. But the British withdrew in December 1782, and Charleston recovered with remarkable speed. The rice was still growing. The labor system was still intact. The money came back. The city's name was officially changed from Charlestown to Charleston in 1783. And then a teenage girl's experiment with a plant most people have forgotten made the city even richer. Eliza Lucas was 16 years old when her father, a British military officer, left her in charge of his plantations near Charleston in the late 1730s. She began experimenting with indigo, the plant that produced a blue dye prized by English textile manufacturers. With persistence and considerable intelligence, she succeeded in producing a viable crop. By 1747, South Carolina was exporting over 138,000 pounds of indigo dye to England, worth more than 16,000 pounds sterling. Parliament sweetened the deal by placing a bounty of 6 pence per pound on Carolina indigo. By 1760, exports had surged to 500,000 pounds. Indigo could be grown on land too dry for rice, and it used the same enslaved labor force during the off-season. It was, in effect, a second cash crop layered on top of the first, and it made wealthy planters wealthier still. Eliza Lucas married Charles Pinckney, and the family became one of the most prominent dynasties in South Carolina. 2 of their sons would serve as diplomats and statesmen. But it was the mother's work with a finicky plant that had doubled the colony's agricultural revenue. By the turn of the 19th century, cotton had joined rice and the remnants of indigo as the staples of the low-country economy. Sea Island cotton, a long staple variety prized for its silky fiber, grew beautifully on the barrier islands near Charleston. The city remained wealthy, but something had shifted. Charleston was no longer the dominant American port it had been. New York was growing explosively. New Orleans was capturing more of the cotton trade. By the time of the 1860 census, Charleston's population stood at 40,522, making it the 22nd largest city in the United States. Respectable, but a far cry from 4th, which is where it had ranked in the 1770s. The world was getting bigger, and Charleston was not keeping up. What Charleston did have still was pride and certainty, and a political class that had sharpened its arguments to a razor edge over 3 decades of constitutional debate. South Carolina's planter elite had been talking about states' rights and the defense of their institutions since the nullification crisis of 1832, when John C. Calhoun, a Charlestonian by adoption if not by birth, had nearly brought the state to armed conflict with the federal government over the question of tariffs. But everyone understood that tariffs were a proxy. The real question was whether a society built entirely on enslaved labor could survive inside a union that was increasingly uncomfortable with it. By 1860, the census reported that South Carolina's population was 57% enslaved, the highest proportion of any state. In Charleston itself, the percentage was smaller, but the economic dependence was total. The value of enslaved people as property dwarfed the value of land, of buildings, of every other form of wealth combined. The entire financial structure of the Low Country, the credit systems, the mortgages, the insurance policies, was underwritten by human collateral. On December 20th, 1860, at Institute Hall on Meeting Street, a handsome Italianate building that had opened just a year earlier, delegates to a special convention voted unanimously to declare South Carolina's secession from the United States. It was the first state to leave. Charleston celebrated with bonfires and cannon fire. The city had chosen its side, and it had chosen it with the same confidence with which it had built its townhouses and its concert halls and its racetracks. 4 months later, at 4:30 in the morning on April 12, 1861, a Confederate mortar on Fort Johnson fired a shell that arced across Charleston Harbor and exploded over Fort Sumter. Every battery in the harbor opened fire. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. No one was killed. The Union garrison surrendered, and the Confederacy had its first victory. But the view from the battery, the seawall promenade at the tip of the peninsula where the finest houses faced the water, now included a fort that would become the most contested piece of real estate in the war. Fort Sumter sat in the middle of the harbor like a dare, and the Union would spend the next 4 years trying to take it back. What the war did to Charleston was not a single blow, but a series of them, each one devastating. The first came not from the enemy, but from the sky. On the night of December 11, 1861, just 8 months after Fort Sumter, a fire broke out near the corner of East Bay and Hazel Streets. A cold gale was blowing from the northeast. The flames raced southwest across the peninsula. By noon the next day, the fire had consumed 540 acres, nearly a third of the city, along with 575 homes, 5 churches, and countless businesses. Among the buildings destroyed was Institute Hall, the very place where secession had been declared less than a year before. Estimated damages ran to $7 million, and the losses bankrupted all but one of the city's insurance companies. General Robert E. Lee was in Charleston that night. He had to be evacuated from the Mills House Hotel as the fire approached. Then came the siege. In the summer of 1863, Union forces established themselves on Morris Island at the mouth of the harbor and began a bombardment that would last 587 days. The fighting for the island produced some of the war's most famous episodes. On July 18, 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first African-American regiments in the Union Army, led an assault on the Confederate battery Wagner that would later be immortalized in the film Glory. The attack failed, but the regiment's courage under fire helped change the national debate about black soldiers. 7 months later, on February 17, 1864, the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley, a hand-cranked vessel barely large enough for its 8-man crew, sank the USS Housatonic in the harbor, the first successful submarine attack in the history of warfare. The Hunley never returned. It sank with all hands, and its wreck would not be found for over a century. Meanwhile, nearly 7 million pounds of artillery projectiles were fired at Fort Sumter over the course of the siege, reducing it to rubble. But the Confederates never surrendered it. The Union also trained its guns on the city itself. The area south of Calhoun Street became known as the Shell District. Charlestonians who could afford to moved north beyond the range of the guns. Those who couldn't lived with the shelling. Historic churches, houses, and graveyards were damaged or destroyed. When Jefferson Davis visited in November of 1863, he declared that it was better to leave the city a heap of ruins than to surrender it. He very nearly got his wish. By February 1865, General William Tecumseh Sherman's army was cutting through the interior of South Carolina, headed for Columbia. The Confederate commander, P.G.T. Beauregard, ordered Charleston evacuated. Before the last troops left, they set fire to cotton warehouses, destroyed artillery and equipment, and detonated ammunition stores. On February 18, 1865, the mayor surrendered the city to Union forces. A Northern reporter who entered with the troops described what he saw. A city of ruins, silent, in deepest humiliation. The military band played Hail Columbia as they marched in. The sound floated through empty streets. What the reporter did not know, what perhaps no one fully understood at the time, was that Charleston would not recover from this for 100 years. Not just the physical damage, which was extensive, but the economic annihilation. The entire wealth of the planter class had been tied up in two forms of property: land and enslaved people. Emancipation did not just free 4 million human beings. It erased overnight what had been the largest single category of capital in the Southern economy. In South Carolina, where enslaved people had made up 57% of the population, the destruction of that wealth was total. The rice plantations could not function without forced labor. The plantation economy was finished. And Charleston, which had been built on that economy the way a cathedral is built on a foundation, had nothing underneath it anymore. For the next 3 decades, the city simply endured. The rice plantations, without forced labor to maintain the elaborate dike and canal systems, fell into disrepair. The tidal fields silted up. Louisiana, which had mechanized its rice production more successfully, surpassed South Carolina in output by the 1880s and never looked back. Carolina gold rice, which had been the foundation of the city's wealth for a century and a half, essentially vanished as a commercial crop. The population grew slowly, from about 49,000 in 1880 to roughly 55,000 by 1900. But it was a population living in faded grandeur, surrounded by buildings it could not afford to maintain and certainly could not afford to replace. Where northern cities were tearing down their old quarters and building upward, skyscrapers in Chicago, department store palaces in New York, Charleston was standing still. The phosphate mining industry, which had sprung up in the 1870s when rich deposits of phosphate rock were discovered in the Low Country, provided a modest economic pulse. The rock was used for fertilizer, and for a time, Charleston was a center of the trade. But cheaper sources of phosphate were eventually found elsewhere, and that industry, too, declined. And then, on the evening of August 31st, 1886, the earth itself turned against Charleston. At 9:50 p.m., a massive earthquake, later estimated at magnitude 6.9 to 7.3, struck the city. The shaking lasted about 60 seconds. 60 people were killed. Nearly every building in Charleston was damaged. The cost was estimated at $5 to $6 million, roughly $200 million in today's money, in a city that had almost nothing to spare. More than 2,000 buildings were affected across the southeastern United States, but the epicenter was Charleston, and Charleston bore the worst of it. Brick structures were particularly devastated. For weeks afterward, residents camped in the streets and parks, afraid to sleep indoors. Over 300 aftershocks rattled the city over the following 35 years. It was in the aftermath of this earthquake that the iron bolts appeared. Engineers drove long iron rods through the walls of damaged buildings, threading them from one side to the other, then secured them with decorative iron plates, stars, circles, crosses, on the exterior facades. Every week, workers would tighten the bolts, gradually pulling the cracked walls back into alignment. It was a kind of mechanical stitching, a way to hold buildings together when there was no money to rebuild them. Those iron plates are still there, on hundreds of buildings throughout the historic district. They are, in a way, the most honest symbol Charleston has: beautiful, pragmatic, and born of the inability to start over. By the early 1900s, Charleston had settled into something that looked, from the outside, like graceful decay. The grand houses south of Broad were still standing, but many were subdivided into apartments or boarding houses. Rainbow Row, a stretch of Georgian row houses on East Bay Street that had survived the fire of 1778, but not the poverty of the post-war decades, had devolved into near-slum conditions, the plaster crumbling, the woodwork rotting, families packed into rooms that had once held dinner parties. King Street, the city's main commercial thoroughfare, was functional but faded. The great plantations upriver were in various states of collapse. Middleton Place, which had boasted what were considered the oldest landscaped gardens in America, had been burned by Union troops in 1865, and its surviving buildings sat largely unattended. The naval shipyard, established on the Cooper River in 1901, became the city's largest employer, and for much of the 20th century, military installations, the shipyard, the Army Depot, the Air Force Base, would be the economic backbone of a city that had no other major industry. The population crept upward to 68,000 by 1920, to 71,000 by 1940, but the per capita income remained well below the national average. In the 1930s, Charleston ranked among the poorest cities of its size in the United States. A visitor from the north, coming south on U.S. Route 17, would have seen a beautiful, crumbling, half-forgotten port city that seemed to belong to another century entirely. And then something happened that was so improbable, so perfectly ironic, that no novelist would dare invent it. Charleston's poverty saved its architecture. Because the city couldn't afford to tear down its old buildings and put up new ones, the old buildings survived. The single houses south of Broad, the Georgian row houses on East Bay, the churches, the civic buildings, the wrought iron gates, and the earthquake bolts, all of it remained decade after decade because demolition costs money, and so does construction, and Charleston had neither. In any other American city of comparable age, in a Baltimore or a Richmond or certainly a New York, those buildings would have been torn down for parking lots or gas stations or modern office towers. In Charleston, they simply stood there, slowly deteriorating, waiting for someone to realize what they were worth. The woman who realized it first was named Susan Pringle Frost. She was a court stenographer, a suffragette, and, starting in 1909, a real estate agent. She was also a Charlestonian to her bones, born in 1873 in the Miles Brewton House itself. In 1920, Frost learned that the Joseph Manigault House on Meeting Street, a circa 1803 Federal-style dwelling designed by the architect Gabriel Manigault for his brother Joseph, a man who had owned several plantations and more than 200 enslaved laborers, was slated for demolition. The plan was to replace it with a gas station. Frost called a meeting. On April 21, 1920, 32 people gathered at 20 South Battery, and together they founded the Society for the Preservation of Old Dwellings, now known as the Preservation Society of Charleston. It was the first community-based historic preservation organization in the United States. The Manigault House was saved, but Frost understood that saving individual buildings one crisis at a time was not enough. What Charleston needed was a legal framework that would protect entire neighborhoods. In 1931, largely through the Society's efforts, the Charleston City Council passed the nation's first historic district zoning ordinance, establishing a board of architectural review and designating a 138-acre old and historic district. No building within that district could be demolished or significantly altered without the board's approval. It was a radical idea at the time. It has since been adopted in some form by thousands of communities across America. But Charleston did it first, and it did it because the alternative, watching a gas station replace a masterpiece, was something Susan Pringle Frost refused to accept. Frost did more than lobby. She bought properties. In the 1920s, she purchased 6 of the dilapidated row houses on East Bay Street. She lacked the money to restore them immediately, but she held on. In 1931, another woman, Dorothy Porcher Legg, bought several of the houses, renovated them, and painted them in Caribbean pastels, pinks, blues, yellows, ochres. Other owners followed suit. The block became known as Rainbow Row. Today, it is one of the most photographed streetscapes in America. In the 1920s, it was a slum that one stubborn woman refused to let die. While Frost was saving buildings, a writer named DuBose Hayward was doing something equally important. He was telling a story about Charleston that the rest of the country wanted to hear. Hayward, born in the city in 1885, published a novel called Porgy in 1925. It was a story about the African-American community of Charleston's waterfront, the Gullah culture of the Sea Islands, the poverty and vitality of a neighborhood he called Catfish Row. He and his wife Dorothy adapted it into a play in 1927, and then, in collaboration with George and Ira Gershwin, into an opera, Porgy and Bess, which premiered in 1935 and would eventually be recognized as one of the great American operas. Hayward described Charleston in the opening of Porgy as the city that time had not forgotten before it was destroyed. The line captured something essential. Charleston's beauty was inseparable from its ruin, and its ruin was inseparable from its history. Hayward was part of what came to be called the Charleston Renaissance, a burst of artistic and literary creativity in the 1920s and 1930s that included painters like Alfred Hutty, who arrived from New York and reportedly sent a telegram home reading, "Come quickly, have found heaven," and Alice Ravenel Huger Smith, whose luminous watercolors of the low country marshes captured a landscape that was disappearing. The Charleston Renaissance also included an unlikely architectural resurrection. In 1937, the old Planters Hotel on Church Street was reconstructed as the Dock Street Theater, 2 centuries after the original playhouse had opened on the same block. The first production in the reopened theater was The Recruiting Officer, the same play that had opened the original in 1736. It was a gesture of continuity so deliberate it almost seemed defiant. Charleston was saying, even in the middle of the Depression, that it remembered what it was. But memory alone does not pay the bills. The mid-20th century was not kind to most American downtowns, and Charleston was no exception. The population peaked at about 71,000 in 1940, and then began to fall, dropping to 70,000 by 1950, and then sharply to 60,000 by 1960, as residents moved to the suburbs and the old peninsular city hollowed out. The naval shipyard kept the economy alive, but it was a dependency, not a foundation. King Street lost retailers. Buildings deteriorated. The Cooper River Bridge, opened in 1929, had made the suburban towns across the harbor more accessible, and people left. But the preservation framework held. The Board of Architectural Review kept working. The historic district expanded. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, tourism began to replace the military as the city's economic engine. People started coming to Charleston not despite its age, but because of it. They came to see the single houses and the piazzas, the churches and the wrought iron, the earthquake bolts and the palmetto trees, the streets that had not been widened for automobiles because there had never been enough money or enough political will to widen them. In 1975, a 32-year-old lawyer named Joseph P. Riley, Jr. was elected mayor of Charleston. He would hold the office for 40 years until 2016, one of the longest mayoral tenures in American history. And in that time, he would transform the city more profoundly than anyone since the rice planters. Riley understood that Charleston's past was an economic asset, but only if it was curated, invested in, and made accessible. He pushed for the construction of Waterfront Park, which opened in 1990 on the site of old commercial wharves along the Cooper River. Wharves where 2 centuries earlier, barrels of Carolina gold rice had been loaded onto ships bound for London. The park cost $12 million, and when it opened, with its pineapple fountain and its sweeping promenade along the seawall, it gave Charlestonians something they hadn't had in generations, a reason to walk down to the water and simply be there, in the open air, looking at the harbor where all of it had begun. Riley championed the renovation of the Charleston Place Hotel and retail complex on King Street, which, when it opened in 1986, signaled that the old commercial corridor was not dead, just sleeping. He supported the Spoleto Festival USA, founded in 1977 by the Italian-American composer Giancarlo Menotti as a companion to his festival in Spoleto, Italy, which brought world-class performing arts to the city every spring and put Charleston on the international cultural map in a way it hadn't been since the St. Cecilia Society concerts of the 1700s. Spoleto turned Charleston into a destination, not just for architecture buffs and history enthusiasts, but for opera lovers, theater-goers, and the international arts crowd. And every one of those visitors needed a hotel room and a restaurant reservation. By the 1990s and into the 21st century, the transformation was unmistakable. Charleston became one of the most acclaimed tourist destinations in the world, winning Best City awards from travel magazines with a regularity that became almost monotonous. King Street filled up again, not with the hardware stores and five and dimes of the mid-century, but with restaurants, galleries, and boutique hotels. Real estate prices south of Broad climbed into the millions. The population began to grow again, surpassing 96,000 by 2000 and continuing to rise. The city that had been too poor to change had become, precisely because it hadn't changed, one of the most desirable addresses in the country. The irony of this, and it is a deep structural irony, not a superficial one, is worth sitting with. The buildings that tourists come to admire were built with the profits of enslaved labor. The preservation of those buildings was made possible by a century of poverty that was itself a direct consequence of the destruction of the slave economy. And the tourism economy that now sustains the city depends in large part on the beauty of structures whose original construction was funded by one of the most brutal labor systems in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Charleston's visitors walked down streets that were designed for horse-drawn carriages, past houses that were built by enslaved craftsmen, through a historic district that survives because the city was too broken to modernize. Every layer of the city's appeal is braided together with every layer of its history, and separating them is not possible. On the tip of the peninsula, where the Battery curves along the seawall and the grandest houses face the harbor, you can stand today and look out across the water. Fort Sumter is visible in the middle distance, low and gray. Sullivan's Island stretches along the horizon to the right. To the left, the modern port facilities line the Cooper River. Behind you, the Miles Brewton House still stands on King Street, still in the hands of the same family, its Portland stone columns catching the afternoon light the same way they did when George III was king. The chevaux de frise, the jagged iron spikes that were added to the perimeter wall after a thwarted slave rebellion in 1822, still crown the garden wall, beautiful and menacing in equal measure. The house has survived 2 wars, a great fire, an earthquake, a century of poverty, and the relentless appetite of the American real estate market. It has been headquartered by the British and occupied by the Union. Its iron gate is still locked. Its piazzas still face south. Nobody has ever torn it down, not because anyone decided it was a landmark, though it is, but because the family that owned it simply refused to leave, and the city that surrounded it simply could not afford to become something else. There is no moral to this. Charleston is not a parable. It is a city that was built on rice and human trafficking, that became the wealthiest settlement in colonial America, that fired the first shots of the Civil War, that was burned and shelled and shaken to its foundations, that spent a century in decline so deep it was practically invisible to the rest of the country, and that emerged on the other side with its streetscape so intact that people now fly from around the world to see it. The rice is gone. The plantations are museums or ruins. The naval shipyard closed in 1996. The wealth comes from visitors now, from people who walk the same streets where barrels of Carolina gold were once rolled to the wharves, where enslaved Africans were once sold at public auction, where a fire watchman once hung a red lantern from the steeple of St. Michael's Church to warn of the blaze that was already out of control. The lantern is not there anymore. The steeple is. It has been there since 1761. It is painted white. On a clear evening, you can see it from the harbor, the same way sailors saw it 260 years ago when Charleston was the richest city in America and the ships were coming in full of rice.